Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're tackling a philosophical heavyweight, John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism. This book, published in 1879, lays out a system of ethics that's both influential and controversial.
It really is. Utilitarianism is one of those works that forces you to examine your own moral compass.
Absolutely. So before we dive into the details, let's give our listener a roadmap of what we'll be covering. At its core, utilitarianism judges actions based on their outcomes, specifically whether they promote happiness and minimize pain for the greatest number of people. This is what Mill calls the greatest happiness principle.
Right. And throughout the book, Mill defends this principle against common criticisms and explores its implications for how we think about justice, rights, and even the very foundation of morality. He delves into the different types of happiness, arguing that intellectual and moral pleasures are superior to mere physical ones.
It's not just about feeling good in the moment, but about living a life that's truly fulfilling and contributes to the well-being of others.
Precisely. And that leads to some fascinating questions about how we balance individual happiness with the happiness of the whole, how we deal with situations where those interests seem to clash, and what role things like personal virtue play in a utilitarian framework.
It's a lot to unpack, but I think our listeners in for a treat. So let's dive right into the main text, starting with chapter 1, where Mill sets the stage for his argument.
Okay, so in this first chapter, general remarks, Mill jumps right in, pointing out how much debate there's been over the centuries about what makes actions right or wrong. He observes something quite interesting. Even philosophers who reject the idea of utility as the basis for morality often end up using utilitarian arguments when they discuss specific moral issues.
It's almost like they can't escape the logic of considering consequences, even if they claim to base their morals on something else. He even uses Kant as an example, right?
Exactly. He points to Kant's metaphysics of ethics and highlights how when Kant tries to justify specific moral rules, he ends up falling back on arguments about the bad consequences that would result if those rules weren't followed.
So even those who claim to find morality in something other than happiness seem to acknowledge that happiness plays a role.
It seems so. It raises the question of whether the desire to avoid suffering, if not outright achieve happiness, might be a more fundamental part of our moral thinking than we realize.
That's a thought-provoking point. Okay, let's move on to chapter 2. What utilitarianism is. This is where Mill lays out the core of his ethical system, right?
Absolutely.
This is where we get the famous definition of utilitarianism. Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. And by happiness, Mill means pleasure and the absence of pain.
So the basic idea is to maximize pleasure and minimize pain for the greatest number of people. But as you mentioned earlier, Mill doesn't think all pleasures are created equal.
Right. This is where the distinction between higher and lower pleasures comes in. Mill argues that intellectual, moral, and aesthetic pleasures are inherently more valuable than purely physical or sensual pleasures. This is where that famous line comes in. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied.
Exactly. That quote really captures the essence of Mill's point. He's saying that a life filled with deep-thinking moral action and appreciation of beauty is ultimately a more fulfilling and happy life than one solely focused on simple gratification.
So we shouldn't just be chasing whatever feels good in the moment, but consider the long-term impact of our choices on our overall well-being.
Precisely. It's about cultivating a more thoughtful and considered approach to happiness.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do we determine which pleasures are higher? Is it just a matter of personal preference?
Mill suggests that those who have experienced a wide range of pleasures are best equipped to judge. It's not about following a set list, but about developing the capacity for introspection and understanding what truly brings lasting satisfaction.
So it's a bit subjective, but not completely arbitrary. We develop a sense of what truly matters through experience and careful reflection.
That's right. It's an ongoing process of self-discovery and moral growth.
This brings to mind a common criticism of utilitarianism. How can we possibly calculate the consequences of every action before we act? It seems impractical and paralyzing.
It's a valid concern, and Mill tackles it head-on. He argues that we don't need to start from scratch every time. Humanity has accumulated a vast amount of experience about the general tendencies of actions. We learn from this shared wisdom and develop moral rules and principles to guide our conduct.
So we have a set of pre-calculated moral guidelines based on the experiences of past generations. We don't need to reinvent the wheel every time we make a decision.
Exactly. And of course, there will be unique situations where those guidelines don't fit perfectly, and we need to exercise judgment. But even then, we can rely on our understanding of the greatest happiness principle.
It's a balance between following established moral principles and adapting to specific circumstances. So it's not as daunting as it might initially seem.
Right. Now, Chapter 3 delves into of the ultimate sanction of the principle of utility, which explores the motivation behind moral behavior.
In other words, what drives us to actually follow this greatest happiness principle. It's one thing to understand it intellectually, but what makes us put it into practice?
Mill distinguishes between external and internal sanctions. External sanctions are things like fear of punishment or hope of reward, whether it's from social disapproval laws or even divine judgment.
Okay, so the classic carrot and stick approach. Do good to avoid punishment, get rewarded for good behavior.
Yeah.
But you said Mill focuses more on internal sanctions.
Yes, because he argues that external sanctions, while important, are not the most reliable or powerful motivators. Internal sanctions, on the other hand, come from within.
So what are these internal sanctions?
The most important one, according to Mill, is our conscience. That feeling of pain or guilt we experience when we violate our own moral standards, even if no one else knows.
It's that inner voice telling us we've done wrong, even if we got away with it externally. But how do we develop a conscience? Are we born with it?
That's a great question. Mill acknowledges the debate about whether our sense of duty is innate or learned, regardless of its origin. He argues that our moral faculty can be shaped by education and social influences.
So we learn to associate feelings of satisfaction with actions that promote happiness, and feelings of guilt with actions that cause harm. It's a process of moral conditioning.
Yes, and Mill connects this to our natural social inclinations. He argues that as humans, we have a deep desire for unity and harmony with others. We thrive in communities where people care about each other's well-being.
So this social instinct provides a natural basis for utilitarian morality. When we see ourselves as part of a larger community, it becomes natural to consider the interests of others.
Exactly. And Mill believes that through education and social progress, we can further cultivate this sense of unity and make it an even stronger motivator for ethical behavior.
That's a pretty optimistic view of human nature.
It is. Now, Chapter 4 is titled Of What Sort of Proof the Principle of Utility is Susceptible. Here, Mill takes on the question of how we can even know that happiness is the ultimate good.
That is a fundamental question. After all, you can't exactly prove it scientifically.
Right. Mill acknowledges this, but he argues that the strongest evidence is simply that people do in fact desire happiness. It's a fundamental human motivation observable in our daily lives.
So it's not a matter of abstract reasoning, but of recognizing a basic fact about human nature. We all strive for happiness in one way or another.
Exactly. And if that's the case, then it makes sense to define right and wrong, based on whether actions contribute to or detract from that ultimate goal.
Okay, that's a pretty compelling point. But even if we accept happiness as the ultimate good, should we be constantly calculating the potential happiness or pain of every little action we take? That seems exhausting.
Mill recognizes this would be impractical. That's why he emphasizes the importance of those moral rules and principles we talked about earlier. They act as a sort of shortcut based on our accumulated knowledge of what generally promotes happiness.
They serve as guidelines for navigating the complexities of daily life. We don't need to do a complex ethical calculus every time we make a decision.
Right. We can rely on those established guidelines for most situations and reserve those complex calculations for particularly difficult dilemmas.
That makes sense. Now, one thing that often comes up in discussions of utilitarianism is the concept of virtue. Where does that fit into Mill's framework?
It's an important question, because critics often accuse utilitarianism of ignoring character and virtue, reducing morality to a cold, calculating pursuit of pleasure.
It's the classic "the ends justify the means" argument.
Yes. But Mill addresses this head-on. He doesn't deny the value of virtue. In fact, he sees it as a vital component of a happy life. He argues that virtuous actions, though initially motivated by a desire to promote happiness, can become desirable in themselves through a process of association.
So we might start acting virtuously because we believe it will lead to greater happiness. But over time, those virtuous actions themselves become a source of happiness. Like we start volunteering to help others, but eventually find the act of volunteering itself intrinsically rewarding.
Precisely. Virtue becomes a part of one's happiness, not just a means to an end. He uses money as an example. We initially value money because of the things it can buy, but some people develop a love of money for its own sake.
Like those who become obsessed with accumulating wealth even if they never spend it.
Exactly. The means become the end. Mill sees this as a natural human tendency, and he believes it applies to virtue as well. Developing a love of virtue isn't just compatible with utilitarianism, it's essential for maximizing happiness both personally and for society as a whole.
So a utilitarian society wouldn't be full of cold, calculating robots. It would be filled with people who genuinely care about each other's well-being and find joy in acting virtuously.
Exactly. It's a much more nuanced and humane view of utilitarianism than its critics often portray.
That's a great point. Okay, let's move on to the last chapter, chapter 5, which is titled On the Connection Between Justice and Utility. What are the key takeaways here?
In this chapter, Mill delves into one of the most common criticisms leveled against utilitarianism, that it fails to adequately account for justice. Critics argue that justice is not simply about maximizing happiness, but about upholding moral rights, ensuring fairness, and treating individuals with dignity and respect.
It's the idea that there are certain principles that we should uphold, even if they don't always lead to the greatest happiness for the greatest number.
Exactly. So how does Mill respond to this challenge? He begins by analyzing our intuitive notions of justice, breaking down the concept into its core components. He identifies elements like respecting legal rights, giving people what they deserve both good and bad, keeping promises being impartial, and promoting equality.
He's not dismissing these common intuitions about justice. He's trying to understand their underlying logic.
Right, and his argument is that these principles of justice are ultimately grounded in their contribution to human well-being and social stability. He's saying that we value justice not just as an abstract ideal, but because it creates the conditions for a happier and more flourishing society.
So justice and utility are not necessarily opposed. In fact, justice is essential for maximizing happiness in the long run.
Exactly. He argues that a society where people can trust that their rights will be respected, where agreements are honored, and where there's a basic sense of fairness is far more likely to promote the happiness of its members.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. But what about situations where following those principles of justice might actually lead to less happiness in a particular case? What if lying to protect someone's life would lead to a better outcome than telling the truth?
Mill recognizes that these kinds of dilemmas can arise. He distinguishes between perfect and imperfect obligations. Perfect obligations are those where we have specific enforceable duties to others, things like respecting property rights or fulfilling contracts. Imperfect obligations are more general and less clearly defined, like the duty to be charitable or to help those in need.
So perfect obligations are those where someone has a specific claim against us, while imperfect obligations are more about our general duty to promote the good.
Exactly. And Mill's point is that while we should always strive to fulfill our perfect obligations, imperfect obligations are more flexible and can sometimes be overridden by more pressing considerations of utility.
So there might be situations where breaking a promise, even though it violates a perfect obligation, would actually lead to a greater overall good.
That's the idea. But he emphasizes that these situations are the exception, not the rule. And even when we believe that utility justifies violating a perfect obligation, we should do so with a sense of regret and a recognition of the moral weight of the obligation we're breaking. It's not about simply dismissing the importance of justice whenever it's convenient.
So he's not giving us a free pass to act unjustly whenever we think it might lead to a better outcome.
Not at all. He's recognizing that there can be complex situations where different moral principles come into conflict, and we need to carefully weigh the competing considerations.
That's a very nuanced view. It seems like Mill is trying to find a balance between upholding the principles of justice and recognizing that there might be rare cases where those principles need to be overridden for the sake of the greater good.
Precisely. And that leads us to his discussion of the historical evolution of our understanding of justice. He uses examples like the abolition of slavery and serfdom to show how our conceptions of justice have changed over time, often in response to changing social conditions and understandings of what promotes security and well-being.
So our view of what's just isn't static. It's constantly evolving as we learn more about what creates a truly just and flourishing society.
Right. And his view suggests that those debates and evolutions will continue as we grapple with new challenges and new understandings of what constitutes a good life for all. Now let's move on to his analysis of how justice connects to security, which Mill argues is essential for happiness both individually and on a societal level.
That's a fascinating connection.
Yeah.
How does he develop that idea?
Mill argues that a sense of security is paramount for both individuals and society as a whole. When we feel secure, when we trust that our basic rights will be respected and that we are safe from harm, we are more likely to flourish and pursue our own goals and happiness. Conversely, when we live in fear and insecurity, our energy is consumed with self-preservation, and it becomes much harder to experience genuine well-being.
That makes intuitive sense. If you're constantly worried about your safety or basic needs, it's hard to focus on anything else.
Exactly. And Mill believes that justice plays a vital role in creating that sense of security. He sees our legal and social institutions as frameworks for ensuring fairness, resolving disputes peacefully, and protecting individuals from harm. When these institutions are just when they operate in a way that is perceived as fair and impartial, they foster a sense of trust and stability within society.
So justice isn't just about abstract principles. It has real, practical implications for how we live together and how secure we feel.
Precisely. And Mill goes on to argue that our understanding of what constitutes justice has evolved over time, often in response to changing social conditions and new insights into what promotes human well-being. He points to historical examples like the abolition of slavery and serfdom to illustrate this point. These were once considered acceptable practices, but are now widely condemned as unjust.
So our concept of justice isn't static. It's constantly evolving as we learn more about what creates a truly just and flourishing society. We're always reevaluating and refining our understanding of what's right and wrong.
Exactly. And Mill's view suggests that these debates and evolutions will continue as we grapple with new challenges and new understandings of what constitutes a good life for all. Think about contemporary debates around issues like economic inequality, environmental justice, or the rights of marginalized groups. These are all areas where we are still figuring out what a just society looks like and how to achieve it.
That's a really interesting way to frame those contemporary issues. We're essentially continuing this centuries-old conversation about justice and what it means in practice.
Right. And Mill's framework provides us with some valuable tools for thinking through these complex issues. His emphasis on the importance of security, his recognition that our understanding of justice evolves over time, and his commitment to promoting the greatest happiness for the greatest number can all inform our approach to contemporary moral challenges.
This has been a really insightful journey through Mill's utilitarianism. As we wrap up, is there a final thought you'd like to leave our listener with as they continue to ponder these ideas?
I think one of the most valuable things Mill offers us is a framework for ethical decision-making that is grounded in a deep concern for human well-being. He challenges us to move beyond simplistic notions of right and wrong and to carefully consider the consequences of our actions, both for ourselves and for others. And he reminds us that our understanding of what constitutes a just and ethical society is constantly evolving, requiring us to engage in ongoing dialogue and critical reflection. So I'd encourage our listeners to continue exploring these ideas, to engage in thoughtful conversations about ethics and justice, and to strive to create a world where happiness and well-being truly do flourish.
Beautifully put. Thanks for guiding us through this deep dive into utilitarianism. It's a book that will stay with me.
It's a pleasure. These are ideas that are always worth revisiting.
Until next time, happy reading, everyone.